The projector still runs. That's the detail I've spent 3 years learning how to say out loud without watching people decide what kind of person I am. I want to get the boring parts right first, because the boring parts are what make the rest of it true. I'm a maintenance contractor, not a ghost hunter, not a film buff, not somebody who believes in much of anything past a paycheck and a reliable truck. I do turnover work on dead buildings, the ones the banks take back, the ones a developer buys and lets sit while the paperwork catches up, the ones a town condemns and then forgets to knock down for a decade. I go in after hours, I inventory what's there, I strip out the copper and the salvage, I document the condition so the insurance people and the demolition people and the lawyers all have the same photographs to argue over. It's night work mostly because the power's usually half shut and the developers don't want liability of me being there when their own crews are. I'm used to being alone in places built to hold hundreds of people. That part never bothered me. Empty buildings are just buildings. They knock and settle and drip. Old wiring hums. Rats find the concessions. You learn the difference between a building doing what buildings do and a building doing something it shouldn't. The palace was supposed to be a 2-week job. That's what the work order said. Downtown theater, closed since I was in high school, bank owned after the last owner defaulted, slated for demolition to make room for the kind of mixed-use block that every mid-sized town in America is apparently required by law to build now. My job was to walk it, catalog the fixtures anybody might want to, reclaim the marquee letters, the brass rail on the mezzanine stairs, the seats, if they were worth anything to a collector, flag the hazards, and confirm the utilities were dead so the wrecking crew wouldn't hit a live line. 2 weeks. I know exactly how long it was supposed to be because I still have the invoice I never sent. I grew up in this town. I should say that now, instead of letting it sit and ambush you later, because it matters, and because it's the part I'm least proud of pretending didn't matter. The palace was where my dad took me on Saturdays when I was a kid. He worked the rail yard and he was tired in the way men were tired back then, quiet and heavy. And Saturday afternoons at the movies were the only 2 hours a week I ever really had him. We sat in the same section every time a house left, about 2/3 back, under the balcony overhang, where the sound came down, warm and close. He'd get me a small popcorn and himself nothing, and he'd fall half asleep in the first 20 minutes. And I never told my mother that part because I liked that he trusted me enough to sleep. He's been gone 11 years now. I mention it because when I took the palace job, I told myself it was just a building. I'm a professional. I've walked through worse than a place with a few good memories in it. I told myself that, and I believed it for about 4 days. Let me tell you about the building the way I tell the insurance adjuster, because that's the version I trust. The palace was a movie palace in the real sense, built in the 20s as a vaudeville and picture house. One big auditorium seating around 900 with a balcony. They'd closed off sometime in the 70s when the crowd stopped justifying it. Later, some owner had tried to keep it alive by carving the lobby wing into a second and third small screen. Cheap drywall boxes with drop ceilings, the way a lot of these old single screens got chopped up in the 80s to compete with the multiplex out by the highway. It didn't work. It never works. The multiplex won. The palace limped along on second-run features and a summer classic series until the projection equipment got too expensive to maintain and the roof started letting water in over the balcony, and then one autumn, it just didn't open back up. Inside it smelled like every closed theater smells, which is to say it smelled like the ghost of every open one. stale popcorn oil soaked so deep into the carpet and the seat foam that 13 years of vacancy couldn't lift it. Under that, dust and mildew and the mineral smell of water that had been getting in and drying out and getting in again. The lobby carpet was that dark, patterned, red and gold weave they all used, worn to the backing in a path from the front doors to where the concession stand had been, and still faintly sticky in a way carpet has no business being after more than a decade. The concession stand itself was gutted. Somebody had pulled the soda fountain and the register long ago, but the popcorn machine was still there. A big glass and steel unit with the kettle rusted in place and a scoop still hanging on its hook. The menu board above it had lost half its plastic letters, so it read like a ransom note. SMLLPOCORNGUO box NAHOS. The main auditorium was the heart of it. You went in through two sets of doors, the outer lobby doors and then the padded inner doors, the kind with the little round windows meant to trap the light and the sound. Inside, the house sloped down toward a stage and a screen, and the screen was still hanging, gray and sagging and water-stained along the bottom, framed by curtains that had once been deep red velvet and were now the color of dried blood, where they weren't just gone to rot. The seats went down in long, curved rows, and every row had a brass letter plate at the aisle end. A at the back climbing forward through the alphabet, and every seat had a little numbered plate on the arm. 900 seats, give or take. Most of them fine. A few water ruined under the balcony leak. Row after row after row of them, folded up, facing the dead screen, waiting the way theater seats always look like they're waiting. Up top, reached by a narrow steel staircase behind a door marked staff only, was the projection booth. And this is where I have to slow down, because the booth is where all of it lived. The booth was long and low, running the width of the back wall with a row of small square ports. Cut through to the auditorium, the projection ports, and the little viewing windows the projectionist used. The glass in the ports was still intact, thick and slightly yellowed, hot-smelling even cold, the way glass gets when it's spent decades in front of carbon arc and xenon lamps. There were two big platter-style projectors from probably the 80s, plus shoved against the back wall under a canvas tarp. An older changeover pair, the tall carbon arc machines from way back, kept, I guess, out of sentiment, or just the inertia of never throwing anything out. There were rewind benches, a splicing block, a wall of shelving, and on the shelves, indented gray and rust-brown metal cans stacked flat, were film reels, dozens of them. Trailers, snipes, old features, nobody ever shipped back to the distributor, a can labeled in grease pencil intermission, and another snack reel and one on the end that I'll get to. The electrical in the booth was its own animal. Old theaters pull enormous current for the lamps, so the booth had its own sub-panel, a heavy gray box with the kind of breakers that feel like closing a bank vault. When I did my first walkthrough with the property manager, a decent enough guy named Reyes, who worked for the bank's asset team and clearly wanted to be anywhere else, we confirmed the mains were off at the street. The building was dark. I want to be very clear about that because I checked it myself, not because Reyes said so, but because confirming dead utilities is literally the thing I'm paid and licensed to do. The meter was pulled. The service disconnect at the exterior was locked open. There was no power coming into the palace from the grid. I signed a form that said so. Reyes left me the keys, the alarm code for a system that wasn't even armed anymore. And a lockbox combination for the real estate agent who'd be showing the property to demolition contractors and salvage buyers over the next couple weeks. Anybody comes by with a code, it's legit, he said. Otherwise, it's kids. We've had break-ins. Just call it in, don't play hero. Then he shook my hand and told me the place gave him the creeps. And he was glad it was coming down, and he drove off. And I started my first night. The first 4 nights were nothing. I want you to sit with how much nothing they were, because the nothing is the foundation. I worked the lobby and the 2 carved up small screens first, the easy stuff, photographing conditions, tagging the brass, bagging the trash that 15 years of pigeons and the occasional trespasser had left. I ran a little inverter generator for my work lights and my phone charger, a quiet Honda I set up inside the lobby doors and ran a cord from. That's important later too, so remember it. The only electricity in that building for those first nights was a 2,000-watt generator I could turn off with my hand, powering a couple of LED workstands and my charger. Nothing else in the palace had power. Nothing. I worked from about 10 at night to 5 or 6 in the morning because that's my rhythm and because the developer wanted the daytime clear for their people. I'd eat a gas station sandwich around 2, sitting on the lobby stairs, and listen to the building. Pipes ticking. The wind finding the gaps in the marquee. Once, something living moving in the walls, which I figured for a raccoon, and made a note to flag for the abatement crew. Normal, comfortable even. I've slept in worse places than that lobby. The first strange thing happened on the 5th night, and it was so small that I need you to understand I didn't even treat it as strange. I treated it as a problem. I was in the main auditorium for the first real time, starting the seat inventory, working down the far aisle with my headlamp and a clipboard when I noticed light. Not much. A thin gray line of it, low, coming from up and behind me from one of the projection ports in the booth. It was faint, the color of a television left on in another room. My first thought, honestly, my only thought, was that the agent had been in during the day and left something on. A battery lantern. A phone on a charger off some outlet I'd missed. Something. Because light means power, and I had signed a paper that said there wasn't any, and if there was power in that building that I hadn't accounted for, that was a genuine safety problem and a genuine liability problem, and it was my name on the form. So I went up. Steel stairs, staff-only door into the booth, and the booth was dark. Whatever I'd seen, it wasn't on now. I checked the projectors. Cold, dead, dusty, exactly as I'd left them. I checked the sub-panel and every breaker was off. And I put my meter across the lugs to be sure, and there was nothing, no voltage. The line was dead as a stone. I stood there in the dark, feeling the heat that old booths hold, and I decided I'd seen a reflection. Headlights off the street through a gap in the blackout, bounced down through a port. It made sense. It made enough sense. I wrote nothing down. The 6th night I saw it again, and this time I was closer, down near the front. And I turned and looked straight up at the booth ports, and the light was there. Steady, gray. And it was not a reflection because it did not move when a car went by outside. I timed it. Cars went by it, threw their real light across the lobby doors behind me, and the gray light in the port stayed exactly as it was. It lasted maybe 90 seconds, and then it was gone. And again I went up, and again the booth was dark and dead and cold. I'm going to be honest about my state of mind because the whole thing depends on you trusting that I wasn't looking for a ghost. I was annoyed, I was tired, I had a theory that made me feel like a competent adult, which was that one of those old projectors had a capacitor or a battery-backed component that was doing something, discharging, cycling, whatever, and throwing a little arc or a little glow, and that this was both an explanation and a hazard, and that I should document it and probably tell Reyes the salvage on the projectors needed a licensed hand. That's a completely reasonable thing to think. I want credit for how reasonable I was, because I lost the ability to be reasonable later, and I'd like the record to show I started out fine. The 7th night, I brought a camera on a little tripod, one of the trail cameras I use to catch trespassers, and I set it up in the auditorium, pointed back at the booth ports, motion triggered, and I went about my work. Nothing happened while I watched. But at 12:48 in the morning, according to the timestamp, the camera fired. When I checked it later, sitting in my truck as the sun came up, there were 4 frames. The first showed the booth ports dark. The second showed the center port lit, that gray glow. The third and fourth showed the glow steady. That was it. 4 frames of a light turning on in a room with no power. I told myself the camera's infrared could be doing something weird with the glass. I did not really believe that, but I told myself, and I drove home and slept badly. The 8th night is when I stopped being able to lie to myself about what kind of story this was, because on the 8th night the light stayed on long enough for me to get up to the booth while it was still going, and I saw what the projector was actually doing. I came up the stairs slow. I could see the glow under the staff-only door. Gray and flickering now, not steady. Flickering in that specific way that isn't a flame and isn't a fault the way film flickers. That 24 times a second stutter your eye reads as motion. I opened the door and one of the platter projectors was running. Its lamp was lit. The platter was turning, feeding film up through the gate, and the take-up was winding it back down, and the machine was making that soft, mechanical clatter that I would come to hear in my sleep. The click and whir of film moving through a gate. And it was throwing a picture out through the center port and down onto the screen. And the picture was the auditorium. I need to describe this carefully. The projector was showing on the screen at the front of the auditorium an image of the auditorium itself. Same seats, same curved rows, same brass letters, same water-stained screen, except in the image, the screen was blank and clean and lit, the way it would be before a show, and the house lights in the image were up at that low amber level theaters use when they're letting you find your seat. It was the palace, filmed from somewhere up high, maybe from the booth itself, maybe from the front edge of the balcony, looking down over the whole house. It looked like test footage, like something a theater might shoot to check sightlines or camera placement. My very first thought, and I swear this is true, was, oh, it's just old footage of the room. That's almost a relief. That's explainable. Somebody shot the house once, and this reel got left in the machine. Then I looked at the seats in the image, and I looked at the real seats through the port glass, right below me. And I understood that they didn't match. In the real auditorium below me, every seat was folded up and empty. 900 empty seats. In the image on the screen, 3 seats were down. And in each of those 3 seats, there was a person. They weren't doing anything. That's the part that took the floor out from under me. Not that they were there, but that they were so ordinary. 3 people sitting in a theater, waiting for a movie to start. One near the front on the right, one dead center about halfway back, one further back on the left. They shifted a little the way you do in a seat. One of them, the center one, leaned over to the empty seat beside them, like they were talking to someone who wasn't in frame. They were lit by that amber house light. They were just an audience. Early. 3 people who'd shown up early for a show, sitting in the almost empty house, and the film showed them from above, patient, unhurried, and the real house below the port glass was black and folded and dead. I stood there long enough that the lamp in the projector clicked off on its own, and the image died, and the platter slowed and stopped, and the booth went dark and cold, and I was standing in the heat and the film smell in the total dark with my heart going, and I could hear from below, through the port, the sound of the real auditorium, which was nothing, which was 900 empty seats, not making a sound. I did not sleep at all that day. Here's what I did instead, because I want you to know I did the reasonable things even after the reasonable explanations were gone. I called an electrician I trust, a guy named Coop, who's forgotten more about old commercial wiring than I'll ever know, and I paid him out of my own pocket to come meet me at the palace before my next shift in daylight, and we went over that booth together. We confirmed the service was dead at the street. We confirmed the subpanel was dead. We opened the projectors. Coop knows platter systems. He ran a drive-in for years, and we found what he expected to find, which was old but intact machines, no batteries, no capacitor bank big enough to run a lamp, no power source of any kind. A xenon projector lamp pulls thousands of watts. You cannot run one off a leftover charge. You cannot run one off nothing. Coop stood in that booth with his meter and his flashlight, and he told me, flat, there's no way this thing runs. There's nothing to run it. And I said, I know, I've seen it run. And he looked at me for a second, and then he laughed, because what else do you do? And he said, well, when it runs again, call me, because I'd pay money to see that. He didn't believe me. I didn't blame him. I wasn't sure I believed me. That was the state of things at the end of the first stretch. And I want to lay it out plainly before it gets worse. A closed theater, no power, confirmed dead by me and by a licensed electrician. A projector that turned itself on after midnight. A film that showed the theater's own auditorium lit and ready with a few people sitting in the seats. And a real auditorium below it, dark and empty, that did not match. I could have walked. I want to be fair to the version of me that could have walked, because a lot of people hearing this think they'd have quit right then, and maybe they would have. But quitting meant explaining why to Reyes, and the only true explanation was insane, and the only sane explanation, bad wiring, a hazard I'd already had disproven by the best electrician I know. And under all of it, quieter than I'd admit at the time, was the thing I told you at the start. My dad and I sat house left, 2/3 back, under the balcony. And the center person in that footage, the one who leaned over to talk to an empty seat, the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't stop thinking about how someone sitting alone might, lean toward the seat where they were used to someone being. I didn't say that to Coop. I didn't say it to anyone. I just went back the next night. The footage got more specific, and it got specific in a way that turned my stomach, because the specificity had a direction to it. It was reaching forward, not back. The 9th night, the projector ran at 12:30 and showed the same overhead shot of the house. And now there were 5 people in the seats. The original 3 in the same seats, plus 2 new ones. And one of the 2 new ones was a woman in a blazer with a lanyard, holding what looked like a clipboard or a tablet, sitting near the front. And she kept looking down at the thing in her hands, and then up at the blank screen, and then back down, the way you do when you're waiting on an appointment and killing time. I didn't think anything of her specifically. I noted her. I'd started, despite myself, noting them not in a logbook. I want to be clear, I didn't turn this into some detective's murder wall. It wasn't like that. I just couldn't help remembering them, the way you remember faces on a bus. 5 people now. The house lights in the image were still up. The screen in the image was still blank. Whatever show they were early for had still not started. The next morning, a little after 9, the real estate agent showed up to the palace with a demolition estimator. And I was still there, finishing paperwork in the lobby. And the agent was a woman in a blazer with a lanyard holding a tablet. And I knew her before she said a word because I had watched her the night before sitting in the 4th row, waiting for a movie in a theater that had been closed for 13 years. I'm not going to pretend I was smooth about it. I stared at her long enough that she asked if we'd met, and I said, no, sorry, long night. And she gave me the polite wide berth people give a tired man who stares. Her name was Diane. She was friendly in the professional way. She walked the estimator through the lobby and the small screens, and then she said she wanted to see the main house because the salvage buyers always asked about the seats and the fixtures, and I heard myself say too fast that the main house wasn't safe and that there was a section under the balcony where the floor was soft from water damage, which was true, and that I hadn't finished flagging it, which was also true, and that she really shouldn't go in there until I had. She looked at me. The estimator looked at me, and I could see them both filing me under difficult, and I didn't care, because every part of me had decided, without my permission, that Diane should not sit down in that auditorium. She humored me. They looked at the main house from the doorway, from the top of the aisle, lights up from my work stands, and I stood between them and the seats like an idiot. And Diane said the seats looked like the collectors would want to look, and she'd be back with a buyer later in the week, and they left. And I stood in the empty lobby and felt like I'd won something, and I had no idea what, and I had no idea what game. That night, the projector ran, and Diane was still in the footage, 4th row, same seat, waiting. Now here's where I have to talk about the seats and the numbers, because this is the part that stops being a spooky light and starts being a machine with a logic to it. And the logic is the worst thing about all of it. I got obsessive about the seating. Not with a corkboard and string, I keep saying that because I know how these stories go, and I don't want you thinking I lost the plot that way. It was simpler and worse than that. I started when the projector ran, going down into the auditorium with my headlamp off and standing where I could see both the screen and the real seats, and I started matching them up. The footage was shot from high and back, so the geometry was clean. You could read the amber house lights glinting off the brass row letters in the image A at the back, sloping down, and you could count seats in from the aisle. And I started figuring out exactly which real seat corresponded to each occupied seat on the screen. Diane, in the footage, was in row D, seat 4, house right. I went and stood at row D and put my hand on the real seat 4, folded up, cold, dusty. And I looked back up at the screen where her image sat in it, lit and waiting. And the two things were the same seat. 13 years and one impossible film apart. The 3 originals I finally placed too. Front right guy was in row F. The back left one was in row S, way back under where the balcony overhang started. And the center one, the one who leaned toward the empty seat beside them, was in row L, seat 14 and 15, or rather in 14, leaning toward 15, house left, a little past halfway back, under the overhang, where the sound comes down warm and close. I don't have to tell you where my father and I used to sit. You already know. House left, 2/3 back under the balcony. Row L. I'd never known the row letter as a kid, why would I? But when I stood there in the dark and counted it out and my hand landed on the arm of L14, I knew it the way you know your own kitchen in the dark. That was our seat. That was where he slept through the first 20 minutes, with his hand loose on the armrest in the seat next to mine. The person in the footage in L14 was leaning toward L15. I did not get a clear look at their face. I want that on the record too, because the easy version of this story is that I looked up and saw my dead father. And that's not what happened, and I won't say it did. The footage was too high and too far, and the person too shadowed under the overhang. There was a shape in the right seat, leaning toward the right empty seat. It could have been anyone. Could have been a coincidence of geometry. But I stood at L14 with my hand on the cold arm, and I understood in a way that had nothing to do with what I could prove that the theater had that seat filled, and it had had it filled since before I ever walked back in the door. I need to tell you what I eventually learned about the last night the palace was open, because it's the spine of the whole thing, and because it's the one part I can actually back up with paper. I went looking. The town library keeps the local paper on microfilm, and the Historical Society has a room in the back of the old bank building with boxes nobody's opened in years, and I spent 2 days off the clock going through both. Here's what happened, as near as I could reconstruct it from the paper and from one long conversation I'll tell you about after. The palace's last real night wasn't a planned closing. Nobody threw a farewell screening. It closed the way most of them close, which is not with a ceremony, but with an incident. On a Friday night in the fall, 13 years before I walked in, during a sold-out or near sold-out show, a re-release of some big older film, part of that summer into fall classic series they ran to keep the doors open, there was an evacuation. The paper's account was thin and a little confused, the way local coverage of a chaotic night always is. There was a report of smoke. Later, it was determined to be an electrical problem, a fault in the old wiring behind the screen or up near the booth. Smoke, but no real fire, no injuries reported. The fire department came. The house was evacuated mid-film. People filed out into the street. Engines in front of the marquee, the usual. The paper made it sound minor, a scare. Everyone got out. The theater was closed pending inspection, and the inspection found enough wrong with the old building wiring, the roof, code violations that had been ignored for decades, that it was cheaper to keep it closed than to fix it, and it never reopened. And eventually the owner defaulted and the bank took it, and here we all are. Everyone got out. That's what the paper said. That's what the official record said. Evacuated safely, no injuries. But I found one other thing, and it wasn't in the news coverage. It was in a follow-up item weeks later. Small, buried, the kind of thing a paper runs because a family called and asked them to. A notice about a person reported missing, last seen the night of the palace evacuation, a young man, early 20s. The item didn't connect his disappearance to the theater directly, it just noted he'd been there that night, had told a friend he was going to the show and hadn't been seen since. The kind of case that in a small town gets a few articles and then goes quiet, filed under, ran off, filed under, you never really know people, filed under, sad and unexplained, and eventually just not mentioned. I wrote his name down. I'm not going to say his name here. It felt then and feels now like the one thing I owe him. Not to make him a story beat. Everyone got out, except the seats. Because here's the thing about a mid-film evacuation, the thing that lodged in me and wouldn't come loose. When a theater evacuates during a show, the show doesn't end. Nobody hits stop and rolls credits and brings the lights up and says, "Thank you for coming. Please exit through the doors on your left." The film is running and the fire alarm goes and the house lights snap to full and people get up and leave their popcorn and their coats and stream out into the street. And behind them in the empty house, the projector keeps running. The film keeps going. The movie plays to an emptying and then empty auditorium. It plays the whole rest of its length, the ending, the credits, to 900 seats, and nobody. Until the platter runs out and the tail slaps around and around, or until somebody thinks to go up to the booth and shut it down. And on a night when the building's being evacuated for an electrical fault, when the fire department is telling everyone to get out and stay out, nobody goes back up to the booth to babysit a projector. The show never finished, is what I'm saying. Not really. The audience left in the middle. The film played on to no one. And somewhere in the chaos of that night, one young man who came for the show didn't leave with the crowd and was never seen again. And the last place anyone can put him is a seat in the dark while a movie ran to an empty house. I think, and this is the closest I'll come to explaining it, and I want to keep it as close to the ground as I can. I think the palace never registered that the show ended. I don't mean the building is alive. I don't mean it thinks or wants or talks, and it never once talked to me. I want to be very clear about that. Nothing in that theater ever explained itself to me in words. I mean it the way you mean a machine that got interrupted mid-cycle and is still in some stuck and patient way trying to complete the cycle it was in when the power to the reasonable world got yanked. A show was scheduled. A show was running. The audience was supposed to be in the seats until the end. The show never reached the end. And so as far as the palace was concerned, the show was still scheduled. The seats were still supposed to be filled and the audience was still supposed to arrive. It was still seating people. It had been seating people for 13 years in a film that only ran after midnight in a dead projector, filling the house one seat at a time. Patient as anything for a screening that had been interrupted and never ever finished, and I had walked into the middle of it. The reason the footage kept getting more specific, the reason it moved forward instead of just replaying the past, is the part I understood last and wish I'd understood first. The palace wasn't showing me the old audience from 13 years ago. Diane wasn't there 13 years ago. Diane was a real estate agent who'd shown up the morning after her image appeared in the footage. The theater wasn't remembering its audience. It was assembling one. It was looking at whoever was going to come into the building, whoever was scheduled, whoever intended to walk through those doors. And it was seating them ahead of time. It was preparing the seats for the people it had decided belonged in the audience for the show it still meant to finish. And the way you got shown in that footage was by planning to come to the palace, by being on the schedule, by intending to walk in. I had been walking in every night for over a week. I went looking through the footage for myself after that. It became the thing I did, the awful private thing. Standing in the dark reading the seats, I'd find Diane in D4. I'd find the front right man who I never identified in F. I'd find the back one in S. I'd find the shape in L14 leaning toward L15, and I'd make myself look at it and make myself look away. And I'd count and read and match the rest, and there were more of them every few nights. The house filling slowly, I counted 11 one night, 15 a week later, and I'd search every occupied seat for a figure that was me. For a long time I couldn't find one, and I told myself that meant something good, and I was wrong. about which thing it meant. Let me tell you about the people who came, because they did come, and that's the part that stops being about me and my dead father and starts being about the fact that I could not stop it. Diane came back with a salvage buyer, like she'd said. A guy who wanted the seats and the brass and maybe the marquee. I did everything short of physically barring the door. I told them the balcony overhang was unstable, which by then I'd made sure was documented as true. I kept them in the lobby, in the small screens, anywhere but the main house. And it worked, mostly until the buyer insisted on seeing the seats he was buying, and Diane, professional, apologetic, firm, walked him into the main auditorium with my work lights up, and I went in after them because I couldn't not. And the buyer walked down the aisle, running his hand along the seat backs, appraising, and Diane stood at the top by the doors looking at her tablet. And then Diane walked down the house right aisle, still looking at her tablet, not really thinking about it the way you drift when you're waiting. And she stopped at row D and she folded down seat 4 and she sat in it. I have never moved across a room the way I moved across that room. The buyer said something, startled. I got to her and I said her name, Diane. And she looked up at me, pleasant and blank and a little annoyed, and she said, yes. And she was fine. She was completely fine. She was a tired woman who'd sat down in a theater seat because her feet hurt and she was waiting on a buyer to finish poking around. There was nothing wrong. She got up when I asked her to, gave me that difficult man look again, and finished the walkthrough standing and left and was fine. She was fine. I want to say that as many times as it takes. Not everyone the palace seated was harmed. Most of them, I think, were never in danger at all, because most of them only ever intended to visit the building for a few minutes in daylight, and the theater is patient, but it is also, I came to believe, only able to hold what stays. Diane came, sat in her assigned seat for 90 seconds and left. And the next night she was gone from the footage. Her seat, D4, was folded up and empty in the film again. She'd been an audience member who left at intermission, and the palace let her go because the show hadn't started. And you can always leave before the show starts. The one I couldn't save was a kid, and I'll carry that one. There was a teenager who'd been getting into the building. I'd found signs of him early. A pried side door, cigarette butts in the basement, a spot in the balcony where someone had clearly been hanging out, energy drink cans, a spray-painted tag. Local kid, the way there's always a local kid who's found the way into the condemned building because the condemned building is the most interesting place in a boring town. I'd meant to secure the door and flag it, and I'd gotten distracted by everything else. And I hadn't seen him because he came in the early evening before my shifts, in that gap after the daytime people left, and before I arrived. I found him in the footage 2 nights before I found him in the building. Balcony. The closed-off balcony, which meant he'd found his way past the barrier up there, which meant he was getting bolder. In the footage, he was up in the balcony's front row, leaning on the rail, looking down at the blank screen, and even from the high angle, you could read the shape of a teenager doing what teenagers do in forbidden places, which is act unafraid. I tried to find him in daylight. I staked out the side door he'd been using, and I secured it, and I left a note, a real note, taped where a kid sneaking in would see it, that said, "This building is being demolished. It is not safe. The balcony floor is failing. Please stay out. Someone will get hurt." I meant the balcony floor thing as a scare-off, but it was also true. The overhang and the balcony were the worst of the water damage. I did everything a person can do to keep a stranger's kid out of a building without knowing his name or his phone or his parents. He came in anyway, the way I would have at his age, the way the note probably made it more tempting rather than less. He came in during my shift, which had never happened before, and I heard the side door and then footsteps up on the balcony level, and I went up the closed stairs with my heart in my throat, and I found him up there in the dark, a skinny kid, maybe 16, with a phone flashlight and a face caught between defiant and scared. And I did not handle it well because I was terrified for him, and it came out as anger. I told him he had to leave now, that the floor wasn't safe, that I'd call the police, all of it. And he gave me exactly the amount of attitude you'd expect. But he was also underneath a scared kid who'd been caught. And he started to leave, and I thought I'd done it. I thought I'd gotten him out. And then, at 12:30 something in the morning, the projector came on. I felt it before I saw it, that gray flicker climbing up from below through the open balcony front. The kid stopped. He looked down over the rail at the screen where the footage had started, the overhead shot of the house lighting up amber, the seats, and I saw his face change. Not to fear. That's the thing I can't shake. His face changed to interest, to that soft, slack, pulled-in focus you see on people watching a screen in a dark room. The exact expression of an audience when the lights go down and the picture comes up. He stopped hearing me. I was saying, hey, look at me, we're leaving. And he wasn't there for it anymore. He was watching. He drifted from the rail toward the balcony stairs, the ones that go down into the house. And I got in front of him, and he looked through me, pleasant and blank. The exact look Diane had given me in D4. And he stepped around me, and he went down into the house. I went after him. The footage was running. I looked at the screen as I came down, and I read the seats without meaning to. The way you read your own name in a list, and I already knew, I think, where he was going. There was a new figure in the footage that hadn't been there the night before. Balcony kid come down into the main house. Row H, seat 12. And down in the real house, in the dark, the kid was walking down the house, right aisle, unhurried, and he stopped at row H, and he folded down seat 12, and he sat in it, and he faced the blank screen where the film showed him facing the blank screen. And he watched. I could not move him. I tried. I put my hands on him and I could feel that he was solid and warm and real and breathing. A real kid in a real seat. And I could not make him stand up and I could not make him hear me. And the projector clattered on above us, and on the screen the house lights and the image began, for the first time in all the nights I'd watched, to dim. The house lights in the footage were going down. After 13 years of an amber waiting, ready house, the lights were going down, the way they do right before the picture starts. The theater had enough of an audience now. The show was about to begin. I did the only thing left that I could think to do, which was I ran up to the booth and I shut off the projector. Not gently. I didn't look for a switch. I grabbed the film where it fed up into the gate, and I pulled, and it snapped and spilled off the platter in loops. And the lamp, I couldn't tell you how the lamp went out, whether I hit something or it just died when the film broke. I've stopped being able to reconstruct those few seconds. The lamp went out, and the image died, and the booth went black, and the clatter stopped. And downstairs in the dark, the kid came back. I heard him make a sound, a confused kid sound, and I heard him say, "What the hell?" What? The way you'd say it if you woke up somewhere you didn't remember walking to. And I came down the stairs fast and got him, and this time he came with me, scared and disoriented and swearing and real. And I got him out the side door and into the parking lot under the actual sky with the actual stars. And I made him look me in the eye and promise that he would never come back to that building. And something in my face must have finally reached him, because he promised and he ran. And I never saw him again, and I hope to God he kept that promise. And I think he did, because I never found him in the footage again. His seat, H-12, was folded up and empty the next night. I broke the film to save him. I want to be honest about what that cost, because it's the hinge of the whole thing. When I pulled that film out of the gate, I didn't end anything. I interrupted it. Again, I did to the Palace's finished enough show exactly what the fire alarm did 13 years ago. I stopped the screening in the middle, and I think I can't prove this. It's just what I came to feel with total certainty. I think that's the worst thing you can do to that place. It doesn't want an empty house. It doesn't want to be left alone. It wants to finish the show. And every time the show gets interrupted, it just goes back to seating people. It just starts filling the house again, patient from the beginning, waiting for an audience that will stay through to the end. And after that night, the footage changed in a way it never had before. It stopped adding strangers. It stopped filling seats with realtors and buyers and trespassing kids. The next night I climbed up and the projector ran. Of course it ran. I hadn't destroyed anything. You can't kill it by breaking one reel. There were dozens of reels on those shelves, and I came to understand it was never really about any particular reel, and the footage showed the house. Amber ready, waiting. And it was nearly empty again. Almost all the seats I'd watched fill over those weeks were folded up and empty. It had let them all go. Diane, the buyer, the kid, the strangers, all released. The show had been interrupted one time too many, and it had, in whatever way it does anything, started over, cleared the house, reset. Except for 2 seats, L14 leaning toward L15, still filled, still there. It had never once let that seat go, not in all the counting, not through any of the interruptions. And I finally let myself understand that seat wasn't part of the assembling audience at all. That seat had been filled since long before I arrived. That was the audience that stayed. That was, I've come to believe, the young man who never left the night of the evacuation, seated house left, 2/3 back, under the overhang, in the exact seat my father used to fall asleep in. And it is either the cruelest coincidence of my life, or it is not a coincidence at all, and I have decided I don't want to know which, because both answers are worse than not knowing. And the other seat? The other filled seat? The only new one in an otherwise cleared house? The one the Palace had put in place after I broke the film and interrupted its show and refused to let it finish? The other filled seat was L15, right next to the one that had been filled all along. The empty seat that the shape in L14 had been leaning toward, patient for 13 years, and for all the nights I'd been coming. It was filled now. Someone was in it. And I stood up in that booth and looked down through the port glass at the screen and read that seat the way I'd read all the others, counted in from the aisle. And then I did the thing I'd been afraid to do for weeks, which is I went down into the dark house and I walked down the house left aisle to row L, and I put my hand on the real seat, L15, folded up and cold. And I looked up at the screen where the footage showed a person sitting in it, leaned toward, arrived at last. And even from the wrong angle, even in the shadow of the overhang, I knew the set of the shoulders because I'd spent 100 Saturday afternoons of my childhood sitting right next to them. I'm not going to tell you it was my father. I told you at the start I never got a clear look, and that's still true, and I won't lie to you now at the end, just to close it up neat. but I'll tell you what I know. I know the seat that was filled all along was L14, and I know my father sat in L14, and I know the person in it had been leaning toward L15 the entire time, toward the empty seat beside him, the way a man leans toward the space where his kid is supposed to be. And I know that after I refused to let the show finish, after I broke the film and cleared the house, the theater filled exactly one new seat, and it was L15. The seat beside him, my seat, the seat I sat in every Saturday with a small popcorn while he slept with his hand loose on the armrest between us. The theater had been building an audience for a show it couldn't finish, and when I kept interrupting, when I kept refusing to let it complete, it stopped trying to fill the whole house. It figured out there was only one seat it actually needed. It figured out who I was. It figured out where I belonged. I don't work at the palace anymore. I walked off the job. I told Reyes the building was too dangerous for a solo contractor and to bring in a full crew, which was true. And I never sent my invoice, and I never went back inside. They demolished it that winter. I watched from across the street with the rest of the town, a decent crowd, people who'd had their own Saturdays there. And the excavator took the marquee down first and then went through the roof, and the whole thing came down in a couple of days into a pile of brick and red velvet and 900 folded seats. And I stood there the whole time waiting to feel it end. And I didn't feel it end. Because here's the last thing, and then I'll stop, because you don't explain these things. You just carry them. They built the mixed-use block, eventually, and part of it is a new cinema. Small, modern, the kind with the reclining seats and the app you order your tickets on. I've never gone. But my phone knows where I live, and my phone knows what I've searched. And a few months ago, my phone showed me an ad for that new cinema, a discount, come see a movie in your new downtown theater. And it had the little thing these apps do now. The seat selector, the digital map of the auditorium so you can pick where you sit. And I looked at it the way I look at all of them now, the way I'll look at every seating chart for the rest of my life, reading the rows, counting in from the aisle. And most of the map was open. Gray, available, unselected seats, a whole empty house waiting to be filled for a show that hasn't started. Except 2 seats, house left, a little past halfway back, marked unavailable, already taken, side by side. I closed the app. I still haven't gone. But I think about the man in L14 leaning toward the empty seat beside him for 13 patient years. And I think about how the theater finally understood that it only ever needed to fill one more seat, and I know that somewhere, on some map, in some house that hasn't dimmed its lights yet, that seat has my name on it, and it is willing to wait as long as it takes, because as far as it is concerned, the show was never canceled. It was only ever interrupted. And I have not stopped on the quiet nights in my own apartment, with no theater standing anywhere near me, hearing the small, patient clicking of film moving through a gate, coming from somewhere on the other side of the wall, running a show to a house it still believes will fill.